Good afternoon. Mr. Armkey here with you for CTS 120. Today we're going to be looking at the last chapter in our 1001 exam for the A+ prep. So that is chapter 9. Chapter 9 is all about mobile device support. So this is something that's a little bit newer for the 10th edition. This is slightly more expanded than it had been in the 9th edition. We're going to look at different types of mobile devices, how to identify and use significant features of the 4 major operating systems, though in the current climate, unless you're talking about Chromebooks and Microsoft Surface stuff, you're really only talking about Android and iOS as being major players. We're going to look at configuration for wired and wireless connections on these devices, as well as synchronizing and securing content. We're going to look a little bit at the IoT, or Internet of Things, device family, and we're going to look at some common troubleshooting. So there are, of course, things that were considered common for mobile device support, smartphones and tablets being a big one. There are sometimes what are called netbooks. They're a little bit less common now, but lightweight laptops, ultrabooks, Chromebooks, things like that. E-readers, so things like your Kindle, the Nook. GPS, so of course there's a difference between cellular-based triangulation GPS and true satellite GLONASS GPS. Wearable technology, so that could be things like smart clothing, things like Google Glass when that was still a thing, any kind of smart watch, a Nike Fuel Band or an Apple Watch or a Galaxy Gear, and then VR and AR headsets, so things that will do virtual reality, which would be something like the Oculus Rift, or the HTC Vive. Those would be complete simulations as opposed to augmented reality, which is what AR stands for, which is going to give an improvement to the external viewing port. Essentially something like Pokemon Go, to where you can actually have game interactions through an external camera. So here we would see the Oculus Rift as a communication device that goes into a wired connection with the machine. I do believe that now, in certain circumstances, they have wireless systems that do not require the direct tether connection, but because of the amount of information being processed, both from the accelerometers and the headpiece, as well as the graphical information, the wire is strongly recommended. I remember several years ago when I was working as a cell phone salesman, when the Galaxy Gear VR first came out. That was the was attached to the Note 5. I think that was one of the devices that was really popular. The 4 most popular mobile operating systems, as I said earlier, would be Android and iOS. Android is a Google project. It's largely open source because it's based on the Linux kernel, which is in itself an open source program. As of the time this was written, it is the most popular OS for smartphones. It is the most pervasive. It's used for a ton of things because it doesn't have to be licensed in the same way that iOS would. iOS is an internal-only closed ecosystem operating system. Now, iOS is the mobile version of Mac OS. So if we're talking about OS X, if we're talking about Mavericks, El Capitan, Big Sur, all of those operating systems, this is their mobile variant for that. And now they're branching even further into watchOS for the Apple Watch, tvOS for the Apple TV, things like that. Windows 10 Mobile by Microsoft is based on Windows 10. It used to be that there was a branch called Windows RT. That was a variant based on Windows 8.1 that had been updated, but now they're working on just the 10 and 10 mobile platforms. That was a big part of why they were doing that kind of anti-piracy combatants a couple of years ago, when they made Windows 10 free to everybody, even if you didn't have a valid key, so that way they could get as many old non-supported versions off the market as they possibly could. Chrome OS by Google is built on the open source Chromium OS. So again, everything is leaning towards open source if possible. But in the case of Apple, because they like to maintain a strong level of control over the input-output of their devices, as well as their support structure, strong cryptography, things like that, they tend to be the more secretive of this group. Now, Android originally was referred to internally by cartoon characters. They didn't have names for a while. So 1.0 and 1.1 were Astro Boy and Bender. So they were actual androids that you would see on TV. Then later on, they decided, well, let's go ahead and move towards something a bit more cutesy, like dessert names. So they went from Cupcake all the way up to Pie, which was until about mid 2019. So recording this in June of 2021. So I'd say it's been about 2 years since they walked away from the whole cutesy dessert names thing. Now, I will be full disclosure, I'm not as big into Android as I used to be, simply because I've not been programming as much as I used to. Now, Android 10 changed the naming tradition in 2019, and I believe that they've been sustaining that since then. So this is the Oreo OS. You can see there's a lot of different indicators in here to show where everything is. We've got our primary calendar widget up at the top where it says Thursday, August 2nd. Those will sometimes be paired with a larger version of the system clock, which we can see in the upper right corner. We can see the Play Store icon, which is kind of that rainbow-shaped triangle play button. That is the primary app store for Google. So if you want to download licensed apps, or at least somewhat vetted, then you're going to go through the Play Store. There are other methods for adding apps onto Android devices. And then we can see here, of course, because this is Google-based, they are going to have a preference for Google Chrome, which is their browser, of course, Google Maps, Google Calendar, YouTube, which is a Google property, and then, of course, Gmail, the Google email service. The navigation bar down at the bottom has three what are called soft buttons to where they're built into the display. Now, the hard buttons have kind of faded away. Last I recall, let me see, I can't remember if it was the 8 or the 9 that was the last iPhone that had a physical button. But it did get a little bit weird whenever you transition over, because I was used to using my thumbprint for stuff, and now I have to use Face ID, which is a little bit different. And then, of course, Android, of course, had been walking away from hard buttons for a long time to give you more real estate on screen. So you can see down there at the bottom of the strip, there's the back, home, and then the overview button, which will give you some options. And the buttons will change contextually, so that way different areas of the OS, as you navigate through different screens, those buttons may have slightly different features. Usually the home will always stay the same. So the GUI for Android starts with multiple home screens, usually called pages, and they will support windows, panes, 3D graphics, widgets, things like that. Widgets, I'd have already mentioned this term, is basically a self-contained desktop-oriented mini program, or an applet, if you will. So the clock, the clock, usually we run it in the system tray. This can take the clock and make it into something that's a little bit more visually desirable or aesthetically pleasing. We can also incorporate like a calendar. We can put it into where we have multiple time zones. Let's say that we're somebody that travels. We can have multiple clocks up at once. The iOS, or not, sorry, not iOS, Android OS can use an embedded browser, manage a database using SQLite, which is a reduced operational capacity version of SQL, or structured query language. Connect to Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and cellular networks. We can pin different apps or app containers into a favorites tray so that we can have a little dock at the bottom. Docker and Launchpad tend to be the terms that are used for these if we refer to it in iOS. Notifications happen usually up at the top. These are going to be the little pop-ups that say, hey, something is changing with an application or with social media. So if you play, Candy Crush or things like that, you may have a pop-up that says, hey, your lives are full, come on back and play. Or you received an email from so-and-so if you have them set as a high priority recipient. Digital assistant services or apps. So of course, these would be things like OK Google, Google's voice assistant, which originally was going to be called Michelle, after the voice actress of the computer on Star Trek, Michelle Barrett, wife of Gene Roddenberry. If you're talking about iOS, then of course you've got Siri. There's a number of different voice assistants that are built into different devices as well, but those are the big two. Those are the ones that tend to get the most press, unless, of course, you're talking about non-mobile devices for things like Alexa. Alexa would be in the smart home environment, which we will talk about later on. These are what are called natural language interfaces. Or natural language processing interfaces. So if we talk about fictionalized versions of this, that would be like HAL 9000 from 2001: A Space Odyssey, or of course you could talk about Jarvis from the Marvel Universe's Iron Man series. And the idea is it is able to process input commands via voice, as opposed to having to put in keywords or particular operation strings through a keyboard or mouse, or even a touchscreen. This is able to process vocal information, parse it into the correct keywords, and be able to produce the requested information. So here we can see some graphical representations of what I was just talking about with the notification system. The notification shade, as it's called, because it can be pulled down like a curtain or a shade on a window, is going to give us some quick access stuff here. So if we look on the left, we can see at the very, very top, there are some icons. The one that looks like a fan or a pie wedge, that's your Wi-Fi connection. Do not disturb, of course, allows you to turn on or off notifications based on a particular time frame. So let's say that you're going to bed and you want to make sure that somebody doesn't wake you up in the middle of the night with a phone call. Do not disturb will essentially block those from causing notifications or ringing or any kind of pop-ups. On to the right of that, you can see the auto rotation lock. That will change orientation based on whether or not you have it in platform or landscape mode. Next to it, we have our battery saver, or if you're talking about certain Samsung devices, the ultra battery saver. You've got the mobile data connection, which would say instead of LTE now most likely 5G. Airplane mode, which is going to cut off all of your external radios, including your Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and your cellular data. And then the cast button. Now this is something that's kind of cool. This was one of the first systems that integrated this directly as part of the operating system, well before Apple tried to do it with AirDrop or with any of the normal screencasting stuff you can do with a HomePod. The Chromecast was one of the biggest holiday gifts for several years when I was still working in retail electronics. And the idea was it uses a DLNA compliant protocol to be able to transfer the information on screen directly to an approved wireless capable device. So if we're talking about like a smart TV or a tablet or things like that, you could duplicate your display. So if you were watching a video on Netflix or something and you didn't have a Netflix app on your TV or your home Blu-ray player or DVD player or game console, you could cast it directly from your television or to your television from your phone and be able to control it. Or you could do it from a excuse me. Could do it from a tablet or laptops. I remember that Google Chrome actually had a casting module built into the browser itself from Windows devices. Below that shade, you can see a couple of notifications there talking about things that have been updated. See, the Google Play Store is updating some information. And you can also see that it identifies that USB debugging is currently connected. And this was something that was really useful, but it is also potentially a hazardous part of the Android environment. USB debugging is where we're essentially able to turn on developer mode and make what would be considered root level access changes to the device. Because remember, this is based on Linux. So if it's based on Linux or any kind of star NIX based operating system, so Unix, what have you, there's not a lot of, if you know the command, it's going to assume you know what you're doing. So essentially when you start going into root access and stuff like that, a lot of things that would normally be set as protections are going to be possibly disabled, which means if you leave USB debugging turned on and set developer mode and change a couple of items, you could possibly leave your system vulnerable to some very nasty stuff. So always make sure that if you are going to engage in side loading applications or trying to test development or transferring things using a bootloader, things like that, that you follow all requisite cautions and directions and make sure that you have backups of things and that you very much are aware of the risks that are involved. Now, Android apps are sold or freely distributed from any source or vendor. I believe if you want to charge for an app on the in the Android store, you actually have to write a letter as to why. You have to put some kind of comment as to why it can't just be a free app. So Google through the Android platform is trying to make sure that things are not being charged for that could be provided for free. Google accounts are required in order to download content from Google Play, but if you have a side load capable system, so basically you're downloading it from a website or from a piece of flash storage or transferring it via a computer connection, the Google account may not be necessary. In order to set up an Android app, to build one yourself, developers can download Android Studio. Included in the download are what are called the SDK, or Software Developer Kit, and an Android emulator. So what this allows you to do is, the SDK is part of what's called an IDE. Android Studio is a modification of a Java-based environment called Eclipse. If you've ever used Eclipse before for Java-based development, pretty easy. IDEs often have a lot of autocomplete, very close to what would be called IntelliSense if we were working in Visual Studio. Visual Studio now actually, I believe, has an Android development software kit as well. So it's important to understand that the environment here is going to allow you to structure your code. It's going to allow you to make sure that you're not using keywords incorrectly. It's going to check your syntax and make sure that your code is valid in terms of legal instructions. And then the emulator, of course, will allow you to test it semantically, meaning that we're testing the meaning of the instructions in the environment so that we can see whether or not a particular piece of code works accurately. Again, Android Studio, as part of the whole open source ethos, is free, so you can go on to the site and download it at any point. If you're curious about downloading Android Studio, I definitely encourage you to check it out. Just make sure that you are aware of the potential vulnerabilities of loading an app that is either untested or less restrictive. There are a number of different tutorials that you can pick up online. I've actually had a couple of people ask me to record some tutorials for a basic Android app, which I may do later on. But at present, you know, I would really point you more at going through like Pact, P-A-C-K-T, publishing. Pact Pub actually has, I think you pay like $130 for a year, and you get, it's essentially like $5.50 or $5.99 a month, and you have access to every book they've ever published. And there's a ton of app development stuff in there. And I will say, because Android will work with Java, C++, and Objective-C, there's a lot more flexibility for programmers who come from a number of different backgrounds, so that you can put stuff together. And there are a lot of pre-built or what are called prefab or previously fabricated modules that you can use to build things in. So if you want to, take a pre-built button, you can use the button class and then extend that button class in order to have it activate a certain thing. You can also use Unity to develop games for Android. It will be able to publish on that platform. So another thing to look at there. I would make sure that you are, again, checking your tutorials, making sure that things are signed correctly, digital signatures. If you haven't looked at digital signatures before, definitely check out my security videos on digital signatures with their nature, their possible fallibility, and how to verify. So here we can see the Google Play app engaged, and we can see the different options available to us, apps and games, as well as movies, music, and books. Through Google Play, you can actually purchase movies digitally that you can watch. It's kind of like Google's version of iTunes, but it's a lot more fluid. There's not a whole lot of restrictions on some of that stuff. The ebooks, of course, can be tucked into buying it and reading it through Kindle, or you can read it in some cases through Google Chrome. Music, of course, will go through Google Play Music, so a lot of these platforms are cross-integrated, of course. Apple. Everybody likes talking about Apple because, Apple was really the first widely adopted consumer smartphone. Okay, so Apple developed, manufactured, and sold the Apple iPad starting about, let me see, I got my first one in 2009. I think they were out for about a year and a half before that. So 2007, 2008, somewhere around there. So if we think about it in terms of that, I mean, we're talking 14 years these devices have been coming around. And strangely enough, prior to that, Apple was a very niche market, so their place on the stock market was kind of weird. Like there was a point where Apple stock was like $11 a share, and now it's like over 400 or 500, maybe even higher. I don't play with stocks. I don't have that kind of fortitude, if you will, in terms of patience. I'm I'm a bit of a wuss when it comes to that sort of thing. So, but I do know that they have built an empire on these very, sleekly designed, portable, hyper interoperable devices. Currently, the big devices that we talk about are the iPhone, the iPad, the Apple Watch, and then of course Apple TV. Now there are some other iOS-based devices that are subsidiary to that, but generally they don't get talked about quite as often. iOS is, I said earlier, based on Mac OS, which at the time of the writing was iOS 12. I believe we're up to like iOS 15 now. Every September, they have a keynote address where they're able to provide new information about what's likely to be coming for Apple over the next few years. So that's where you get the kind of the hype move about what's coming out, and then of course first week of September is when the keynote usually is, and then by the last week of September or first week of October is where the new iOS devices start hitting the market right in time for Black Friday and Christmas. So iPhones and iPads tend to have very few physical buttons comparative to their original designs. They'll usually have a sleep and wake button on the upper right side and then volume up and down buttons on the left side. Older versions would have a home button on the bottom at the center. The very early ones were just a button, and then eventually they moved towards, I want to say it's the iPhone 6 is where they started bringing this in, the Touch ID, where it would recognize your fingerprint based on this little metal retainer ring that was around the home button itself. Now, the newer iPhone X models do not have a home button. They either have you put in a passcode or use what's called Face ID, which is where they're able to identify facial features as a form of credential. So here we can see the iPhone X compared to the iPhone 8. And you can see the difference between the home and non-home button. Now you can also look a little bit on the sides and see, especially on the X on the left, you can see the difference in tone of where the sleep and wake button is on the right, the volume up and down is on the left, and just above the volume buttons is the silent button. It's a little tab toggle, if you will, and that allows you to set it to where it rings or does not ring. Here we can see the app switcher. This is from an iPad, actually. This is not from the iOS for the phone, so it's a little bit different. Usually you swipe up from the bottom of the screen, and that will go ahead and bring up this multitasking menu, the part that you would see kind of in the upper left. If you pull from the upper right down, pull the shade, if you will, then you will then see what's called mission control, and that's where you see the cellular data button, the Wi-Fi, the Bluetooth, the music controls, volume and brightness, etc. At the bottom, that's the launch pad, if you will, the docker to launch some of your shortcut apps. So on the iPad, because you have a much larger display, these things are all combined together. If you're talking about the iPhone, then obviously that's going to be much smaller. And then the Apple Watch has an even smaller version of this because it has, obviously, it's only like a 2.5-inch square screen, maybe 3 inches at best, if you get one of the really big ones. Now, app licensing is only done through the App Store. Now, other developers, of course, can write apps for the iPhone or iPad. They don't have to all be internal. That would be really ridiculous if they did that. But these apps must be first processed through Apple. They have to go in and test all of the apps and then sign them. So these have pretty close scrutiny. Not only that, but they also have a membership fee that they charge for you to be a developer. Now, the last time that I was an iOS developer and I had this license, it was $99 a year. It's pretty steep. And then anything that you sold on your app, I believe half of it went to Apple for processing. So, anytime that you download an app that's $1.99, $1 of that's probably going to Apple. If you buy, if you're playing Candy Crush and you buy, some gems or whatever the currency is these days, if it's $4.99, $2.50 of that's probably going to Apple. Now, I don't know how they've changed the position of sharing how much money goes to whom for those microtransactions, but stuff like, Angry Birds, there's those kinds of overnight sensations that exploded, and all of a sudden these people were millionaires overnight. Same thing with like Flappy Bird. So, if it does well, it works out great for both the developer and for for Apple, for the platform. But it is a slower process. So generally what a lot of companies will do when they're trying to release an app on a certain date is they will send it through Apple design scrutiny first. Once they get the approval, then they'll say, okay, we've already got it ready for Android, so then we're going to push it cross-platform on the same day. Or certain cases, you may see that a particular app makes it to Android well before it makes it to iOS because it is sitting kind of in that signature limbo, waiting to be signed off on. Now, in order to load apps onto a device, we have to activate that device by signing into it with a user account called an Apple ID. Now, an Apple ID is a single sign-on, or SSO, that we use for all Apple platform services. That handles stuff for the App Store, that handles stuff for iTunes, that handles stuff for our billing, all of that kind of thing. So again, it's an all-in-one package, but it is also kind of invasive because if somebody breaches that particular credential, they have access to everything. So here we can see the Apple App Store. This was, I mean, again, this was probably 3 or 4 years ago where this screen cap was done. But you know, again, it's not terribly different. Apple's design aesthetic changes very slowly over time. They don't tend to have major revisions. I think the biggest thing that would probably be different on a modern one is the ability to put it in dark mode to where you have high contrast black background with white text. Now let's start talking about the less popular. They're not bad, they're just less popular because app development isn't as robust. And also, you know, if you don't get into it early enough, you're not necessarily going to have the momentum. People don't like to change platforms unless they have a strong negative experience with them. Unfortunately, Microsoft actually had quite a few little snafus that led to people jumping ship quite quickly. Windows Mobile is a simplified version of the Windows 10 OS. You know, it used to be they would do a completely different design thing and they had interoperability, but now they're trying to make sure that they're essentially the same platform with a different interface. So most Windows phones have 3 buttons below the screen, kind of like we see with Android. Start button accesses the start screen, and it has the Windows Start logo on it, just like we're used to. The back button goes back 1 screen, and then the search button pops up a Cortana search box. And of course, Cortana being the voice assistant that we use for Windows devices from the Suit AI from the video game series Halo. Windows phones primarily rely on the start screen for accessing apps. You know, in order to go to the app screen, you're going to have to hit start, and then you'll scroll through the tiles. So the tiles are these little squares that we see here. If you use a Windows 10 operating system, you've seen these tiles before. They can be resized. The icons tend to be fairly descriptive. They tend to be color toned so that everything has a nice visual aesthetic. Lots of right angles with Microsoft design. They like everything to be kind of boxy. Whereas with Apple, they like things to be a lot more rounded. With Android, because there's so many developers, it tends to vary pretty widely. Here we can see we've got I always think it's funny, there's fake GSM network LTE Plus up at the top, so you can see the emulator is running. I apologize for the text being shrunk down at the bottom. It says figure A, notifications appear in the Action Center, and B, the Settings app provides an extensive toolkit for customizing a Windows smartphone. So here's that B. I don't know why my caption got split across the 2 pages, but you know, it's okay. You know, it's not a big deal. You can see here again, they are going to rely on a very boxy look. So you've got these rectangles, you've got an icon squared off, and then you've got a title and a description. So I like that. You know, you've got visual representation, you've got some iconography, you've got a main title, and then you've got a subtitle. And I like that also in the last few years, they've gotten really good about putting a search feature in settings. If you can't quite remember what category something's under, you can type in a little bit of information and pull that off. Now, Windows mobile apps are a little bit more limited because, again, they have to be, whenever you program something, and this is something that you'll learn as a programmer if you get into it, so if you take, you know, CIS 115 or what have you, you'll see that the steps for producing a packaged application that can be read by one of these operating systems is a little bit involved. Now, for a lot of IDEs, like Unity, for example, I'll pick on Unity a little bit, you can package stuff to play on Xbox, you can package on PlayStation, you can package on Nintendo platforms, you can do it on PC, you can do it on mobile, and that's because what it does is it takes the bytecode, you know, the 8 bits of information for each instruction, and can convert it into a form, a machine form that can be readable by that application. It can package those things effectively. Because a lot of the design platforms for Windows mobile apps are very close to that of a desktop app, it's a lot more work involved to try and find cross-platform compatibility. There's not as many pre-built things like that you can incorporate. So instead, usually the apps that are going to come out for Windows Mobile are going to be first party, meaning that they're made by Microsoft or they are made in partnership with Microsoft. Now, you can obtain certain apps from third-party websites via the browser on the mobile device. Again, that is a form of side loading, meaning that we're essentially going around the primary means of delivery for the app's contents. This can be a potential security risk, but it can also give you a little bit of flexibility in testing an app in a live environment as opposed to having to do it strictly through an emulator. Chrome OS is heavily integrated with Google's Chrome browser. That's, of course, Chrome browser is a very resource-heavy browser, has a lot of functionality that's possible. Most of Chrome OS's native apps will actually open directly on the Chrome browser itself, and it relies heavily on having an active internet connection. Chromebook is the only place that you're going to find a Chrome OS. I still have one. My mom bought one a couple of years ago. She used it for a while, and then she got kind of tired of having to lug it around, and she was much happier with a tablet instead. She had a Galaxy Tab 10.1 that she used for a long time that she was much happier with. The Chromebook has a lot of different external ports, so it plays like a traditional laptop, but it's much, much thinner. The OS gets updated much more rapidly, about every 6 weeks. It includes definitions for malware, things like that. It's an all-in-one kind of package. Chromebooks were not a bad idea. I think they were just not marketed correctly, and they were also not put at an aggressive enough price point, in my opinion. I feel like they could have packaged things a little bit differently. And that's just, again, from somebody who worked in consumer retail electronics for a while. Here we can see the Chromebook keyboard. You can see that everything's kind of tightly packaged. You have some different mode buttons up at the top. So instead of having function keys like you would see on a normal 102 key keyboard, you can see that you've got some navigation stuff. You've got previous page, next page, reload, immersive mode, which would be kind of like hitting F11 and going into full screen. Or is that F12? It depends on the app actually, but going full screen. And then overview mode, which would give you some side descriptors. You can do some zoom in, you can do some volume adjustments, you can lock it, you can mute it, all that kind of thing. And then here we can see how the Chrome OS looks. You can see there's the Chrome browser. That's where all your apps are going to launch. Well, at least the native ones will. You've got a settings app in the bottom right corner, which is kind of a weird hybrid of the Windows system tray and the Android notification section. On the left in the bottom, you can see the app launcher, kind of those little favorite trays that are pinned. Those are put into what are called shelves, so you can have multiple shelves on screen. And then you've got your settings window, which again plays very much like Android. It's just got a little bit more of a Windows desktop feel. So I like the idea that this is kind of a hybrid between what Android was attempting to do on mobile and something that was a bit more desktop-y, something that could be used for, let's say you're a claims adjuster working for a car insurance company, and you need to be able to access something that has full browser capability as opposed to a tablet or a phone. That was not a bad idea. Now, over time, because phones have gotten a little bit bigger and the clarity of the resolution of the screen for tablets has gotten better, you can actually have a smaller screen that's still perfectly readable. There's a lot of accessibility stuff for being able to do zoom or things like that. And Bluetooth keyboards, of course, kind of expand the capabilities for different things. So now you can use an iPad. You can use a Galaxy Tab from Samsung to be able to run these things. Now, Google's approach to security with Chrome OS has 4 primary components: sandboxing, verified boot, power washing, and quick updates. Sandboxing just basically means we're going to run potentially vulnerable code in a contained environment by itself. Verified boot is going to be kind of like UEFI for Windows systems, to where we're going to make sure that we have the correct signatures, and we're going to have a handshake between the BIOS and the operating system before everything loads. Power washing is a good way to be able to kind of do a deep scrub and get rid of potentially hazardous things, or just delete things that we no longer wish to use. And then quick updates. So, you'll often hear the phrase divide and conquer. The idea is that if we have multiple people trying to separate this one big thing into multiple smaller things, they're much more digestible. You don't eat a steak by cramming the whole thing down your throat. You cut it into pieces, you chew it up, right? It's very tough sometimes, or it's a lot of food, or for vegetarians, of course. Let's say that you're trying to eat a whole eggplant. You gotta you gotta dice the thing up. Quick updates allow us to say, okay, we have a maximum window of 6 weeks. We may have an update that comes out every 3 days. And we're going to try and do these little chunks so that way if we run into something that's potentially problematic, we can shut it down quickly. We can make sure that the updates are flexible, and we're able to not have to require that somebody stays connected to a cellular connection and it eats up a ton of their bandwidth. They can open it up, download the update, finish it, and be done, and probably only have pulled a couple of megs. Chrome OS apps are going to be contained in the shelf that we talked about a little bit earlier. Again, they are going to open in the Chrome browser, and if we go through the Chrome Web Store, we can probably find a larger number of apps. And some of the newer Chromebooks actually have Android compatibility built in. If you want this on Windows, you'll usually use something called BlueStacks, but there is an emulator style system that can be used in order to run some of these applications. Developers for iOS will only have access to what are called APIs, which are calls to the OS itself. This means that the OS is a little bit more secretive. So again, this is a closed source system. This means that the apps are going to be higher quality because we don't have a bunch of custom methods that are written. We have a ton of prefabs that are already established. And that means that we can also make sure that the app calls that are being made are not susceptible to being intercepted or leveraged for privilege escalation or things like that. Open source apps are a little bit less restrictive, and also that means that there's no assurance of quality. The market's also not always convenient for developers because you have a ton of different versions of Android that are out there, and if a particular operation that your app needs is not included in an older version, it just won't be able to be downloaded, or if it does, it'll cause a crash. So we also have to be very aware of that. So let's talk about synchronization and configuration. So we're going to talk about how to set up a network connection, how to back up data, content, and settings. First thing we need to start with is looking at how we change settings. Most of the settings we need are in the settings app, which is pretty handy. There is an online user guide, and of course, just Google it or hit YouTube. There's a ton of different tutorials out there, so always make sure that you try and find a couple of different ways to envision whatever it is that you've got going on. It's not always necessary to fully understand why something is happening, but I would always read through the directions before you start trying to attempt any changes, just in case it doesn't quite work for your particular version of an OS. So here we can see the Android settings app on the left, the iOS settings app on the right. Not a huge amount of difference other than organization, but it's all the same stuff. So if I look over here on Android and I look at network and internet, up here on the left side of the iOS section, about a third of the way down, you can see airplane mode, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cellular data. If you want to look at things like Bluetooth and cast connections, Bluetooth is there, and then casting is going to be done through something like docking or AirDrop. Battery, we can see that that's listed there. If you scroll down a little bit, battery is also in the iOS settings. We can see storage, that would be under general instead. You've got your iPad storage there. So it's all the same stuff, it's just where it is. So of course this is why the search feature becomes so very handy. Mobile devices might have several different antennas that they use to connect to external networks. So Wi-Fi, of course, GPS, Bluetooth, NFC, cellular. These settings can be modified in order to allow you to connect or disconnect to each of these different pieces. Network connections are often configured using the settings app. So on a Wi-Fi connection, for example, we can add a connection, remove a connection, turn it off and on, see what we're connected to, and then of course the last one is really important, decide whether or not the device should ask us before joining a network. I have never run into a situation where I would think of turning that off. I always want the device to prompt me before I connect to a network, just in case it's one that's doing an evil twin attack or something similar. So here we can see the Wi-Fi settings in iOS. We can see that we've got 5 different networks that are already described other than the one we're connected to, which is Luigi. And then we've got an other setting as well. Other will allow us to connect manually to networks that have their SSIDs hidden. So in this case, they've got asked to join networks turned off that is no bueno for me. I always like to make sure that slider is turned on. Tethering. Tethering, of course, is exactly what it sounds like. We are going to connect our device that is generating the Wi-Fi signal or is receiving the cellular data or what have you via USB to a device that does not have that information, so they can share that connection. Your carrier has to allow tethering, or you have to have an app that circumvents whatever restrictions they may have, and you have to connect it correctly. Now, for a cellular data connection to be put in play, you have to have a subscription with your carrier that includes a cellular data plan. And there are three numbers that we traditionally want to look at. The IMEI, or the International Mobile Equipment Identifier, is a unique number that identifies each mobile phone or tablet device that's connected. The IMSI, instead of equipment, it's going to be subscriber identifier. And then the ICCID identifies the SIM card. SIM card is the subscriber identifier module. I believe it's International Connection Code ID. I think that's what ICCID stands for. You have to make sure you're using the correct SIM. If you're not going to use a SIM, you usually have to use like a what's it called? A UID or something similar. There's a variant that's a pre-programmed code that would go in. But pretty much everything uses SIMs now with LTE. So GSM and LTE require a SIM card. This is going to identify not only you as the subscriber, but it's also going to identify what network this particular device will work on. And if we want to move a device from one carrier to another, we can pretty easily swap that out. Remember that if you do not have a SIM card, you're going to have to do things a little bit differently, but it's not as common. You may also find that you want to turn off data at sometimes. Usually what I do is I just will pull down the shade for notifications or for mission control on iOS. And then if you go to where the little icon that looks like a tower is, sometimes it'll look like a little magic wand with these curved lines coming off of it. If you tap it, it will actually turn that off. Or you can set it to no roaming, or you can set it to 3G or 4G. It just depends on the options on that particular device. Again, it's hard to give a general scope because there are so many devices out there that cover 3G, 4G, and 5G networks at this point. VPN, one that I use quite a bit. VPN allows us to remote in to a secure network and be able to access resources at a site as if we were physically present without actually having to be. So I'm recording at home right now, and if I wanted to, I could actually remote in using the pre-programmed VPN on my faculty laptop and be able to access my CFCC student drive, which is kind of an important thing. Or not my student drive, my faculty drive. It always throws me off because especially if I have to go in and update something on my account, my ID number is the same as it was when I was a student because I graduated from Cape Fear in 2011. So I will be a C double for life, both as an alumnus and as an employee. So being able to add that VPN connection allows me to connect to resources that I would normally only be able to see if I was on campus. And because campus is a good 30-minute drive for me, that can be really helpful. If I need to be able to log in and print a form, or if I need to submit something to my department chair or to the dean, I want to make sure I'm submitting the correct form so I can pull it from that VPN resource. And then companies that have medical information, things like that. There's a ton of laws that exist for data protection. If you take any of my cybersecurity classes, we talk about HIPAA, PCI DSS, all of these different protection services that are in place to make sure that data is being correctly handled while it's being stored, while it's being processed, and while it's being transmitted. We have to talk about the rule of threes for a lot of things. So the VPN is a big tool that allows us to do that. But we have to make sure that we set it up correctly. So here we can see in Android the VPN being configured. We can set a name, and then we've got our different types. In this case, it's PPTP, and a triple P connection with MPPE encryption. And then we've got some advanced options that we can set, like username and password. In certain cases, there is no username and password. You may actually have to enter a server key or some other authentication type to make sure that you are, in fact, committing the correct information. What I will usually do, if I have to use a mobile device, is to find an application related to that VPN. Like if your VPN doesn't have a mobile app, you should really consider why they don't. And I don't say that to disparage any company that decides not to develop a mobile app, but if you want your customers to feel confident in what they're doing, you should provide them something that they can sign in with their credentials, and then all of the technicalities of how they put together, the correct key and making sure they're accessing the correct server and all that stuff should largely be done in an automatic fashion. Of course, be able to go in and customize it if there's a problem, but automation is definitely going to speed it up and make it less problematic. It's also going to create a lot less opportunity for somebody to steal the requisite information. It's a lot easier for a machine to generate an OTP style password or things like that to protect user information. Whenever we're buying accessories for a mobile device, especially if we're talking about personal area connections, very local stuff, we need to think about what kinds of connections are available to us wirelessly and in a wired fashion. For example, a lot of different mobile devices don't include replaceable batteries anymore. A lot of your devices will have magnetic chargeability, to where you can actually put it onto a inductive, what's called a QI-based charging pad, and it will charge wirelessly through the back of your phone. Now, in some cases, if you have a case that's too thick, or if you have a case made out of a certain material, it won't work. But that's why Apple has their little MagSafe locks that they have on the back of their license cases now. We can also use the primary ports, such as micro USB, mini USB, which is almost never used now, and then USB Type-C. Now, I like Type-C because, like the Lightning cable, there's no wrong way to connect it as long as it fits in the slot. So if you remember, when Apple first started coming about, they had a 30-pin connector that was kind of a really long oval, and it had to fit in a very particular way. Like if you tried to put it in upside down, it wouldn't work. It had a little tab to make sure it was registered correctly, and people very much did not like that, because if you're trying to plug in your phone before you go to bed, stuff like that, the room's dark, you're like fiddling about with it. With USB Type-C, if you've got it flat, you can slide it right in, and if you flip it 180 degrees, it'll connect as well. And then USB Type-C is also improving to where now they don't have the rectangular A shell that we're used to seeing. So if we think about USB, we think about that stick of gum shape with a metal tab that comes out of the end that has a little strip on the bottom that allows us to connect into the slot. Now it's just going to be Type-C, which is that really thin oval rectangular connection on both sides. So the cable is pretty much universal on both ends, and then you can connect to the ports. So we'll see how that works. I love the idea of standardizing things to where you plug in, it does what it needs to do. Proprietary cables, golly, proprietary cables always cause problems. So I tend to be very, very shy when it comes to dealing with those. Something that's important to note is that a lot of these connectors will have support for both data and for power, so make sure that you're using the correct cable for your device. There may be certain cases where one is built to be like a fast charging cable, one is not. So of course we want to make sure that we're not connecting something that is going to be too slow or is going to overload our device. So here we can see an Android device with an extra memory card slot. This is a little micro SD slot that you can just kind of tab in. So that would provide some additional storage. Most of the time, if we're talking about micro SD, they'll usually have like a plastic tab that goes over the top as a dust cover. It's not usually going to be exposed like this. Like if you're talking about like Samsung, a lot of them now will have a dual purpose tray that you slot it out. You'll put in your SD card and your SIM card and slide them both into place, so that way you're not sliding those things in and out while the device is running. Here's our, that's that A shell that I was talking about up at the top. So that big rectangular one, that's the one that's largely being replaced by Type-C now. That is a micro USB at the bottom. There is a mini USB here. You can see it looks kind of like, if you flipped it upside down, it would look kind of like a fedora, to where you have the little brim of the hat and then you have kind of that boxy top. And then here's the Type-C. Okay, so imagine a USB cable to where the connector that's at the top, that kind of rectangular oval, is going to be, oh, Mr. Jeanette would say, it's a lozenge. It's a lozenge shape. That's what that's supposed to be. Imagine that on both ends of the cable. And that's kind of where we're going, to where we can have a nice, easy connection that's not difficult to try and finagle, make sure we're connecting the correct way. Now we talked about ports, we talked about cables, let's talk about wireless connectivity. Bluetooth, very common short-range wireless technology that we use for things like wireless headphones or keyboards, things like that. Infrared is a wireless connection that requires a line of sight, which means that from the transmitter to the receiver, within about 100 feet, you should be able to point them at one another. When you were growing up, the remote for your television was probably infrared. If you're talking about, you know, like video game controllers, if they were wireless back in the early 2000s, those were all going to be infrared. My son has a Wii U, and the gamepad for that has a infrared blaster on it as well. Cool thing is that because infrared is so easy to customize, you can have things like universal remotes that are built into these consoles. Like I can actually turn my TV on and off with my son's Wii U using the little TV button, which is kind of neat. Near field communication, NFC. This is a wireless technology that will establish a link between two NFC devices, a transmitter and a receiver, within 10 centimeters of each other. So a lot of people don't think about this. You know, like that's a really small measurement. Usually less than 4 inches for 10 centimeters. Okay, so this means that contactless credit card payments, if you're using, you know, Apple Pay or Android Pay at a store, if you're using an NFC tag, if you're using a NFC enabled like a smartwatch, the NFC tag can be built into all kinds of stuff. So if any of you played Disney Infinity or Skylanders or Amiibos for Nintendo stuff, those were all NFC based. They had a little grain of rice sized tag that would hang out inside of the device, and then when it was put in contact with the reader, it would produce enough of a signal to activate it, and it would pick up whatever the ID code was and produce the results. If you have a pet that has been quote unquote microchipped, most likely they have what's called an RFID tag, radio frequency identifier, which is a pretty good precursor to NFC. NFC is a little bit more complex and doesn't necessarily have to be as passive. Let's talk about email. Now, email, of course, tends to be managed in one of two ways. Either you log into a website called your email client in a browser, or you can have a desktop-based email client, which would be something like Outlook or Thunderbird. Now, to set up email on a mobile device, traditionally you're going to have to open up either settings and go to email, or you can go to the email app and add it directly. Now, to log into this stuff is going to depend on what type of email account you have. Like if you have Yahoo for small business, good luck. There's a lot of different items there, but with 3.5 million breaches, clearly they have some reasons to up their security. Your email address and password, obviously. We need to know what the email is, and we need to know your credentials for logging in. Your names of your incoming and outgoing email servers. So you need if you're using POP, it's going to be your POP server for incoming, and then outgoing will be SMTP. If you're using IMAP, your incoming would be an IMAP server instead. This stuff is usually pretty well standardized, and if you're on a phone or a tablet that's been made within the last couple of years, unless you're using a pretty obscure email client, for the most part, it will automatically convert all that stuff for you. And then if there's any particular security use, so if it uses like a TLS or an SSL certificate, that type of information will be adjusted and need to be confirmed. Sometimes you'll have to use an authenticator. Sometimes you'll have to use an app-based password, to where not only will you need your email password, but you'll need an additional password that's generated by the company that hosts your email. That's part of one of the things that Yahoo does now, is that if you want to add your email account to a mobile device, you have to have an app password from Yahoo Business directly. Synchronization. Okay, so syncing is going to mirror app data among devices in the cloud. And then backups are copies of app data and configuration settings. Traditionally, syncing is going to back up your stuff. Backups will back up not only your stuff, but your configuration. So backups tend to be a bit more extensive. Syncing to the cloud, if you're using Google, then obviously there will be Google storage in the cloud based on your Android account. And then iCloud storage is a little bit different because you usually have to pay for it. If you go to iCloud.com, I believe if you want to use, I want to say it's 5 gigs, that's free. And then for 99 cents a month per person, I think you can do, gosh, I want to think it's like 50 gigs. It's a pretty substantial amount. Maybe larger than that. It may actually have gone up, but in any event, it's pretty simple. And then there's some bulk packaging plans you can do for family, so that you can have multiple individuals that are able to store, I think, up to a terabyte. Some of the cloud storage is really huge. So here we can see the Google Apps Launcher in the Chrome OS. You can see the little dot menu there. That's called an app launcher. And inside of that, you can see several apps that are attached to your Google account. So in the upper right corner, we can see Miss Andrews is logged in. So these are links to her Google Plus site, which is now defunct. The search feature, YouTube, Maps, Google Play, etc. So you can see Google Play is right there on the desktop. So you can manage your different pieces of information. If you're on Chromium and you have something that you've purchased through Google Play, you may be able to download it and access it directly through the Chromium OS, or vice versa. If you have something that's Chromium based that you can use in Google Play, you may be able to access it through your phone or tablet. Here we can see iOS's configuration a little bit different. We can see the different sliders that you can use to turn the iCloud storage on or off. Now, if we're trying to synchronize information to the desktop, there are some automatic and manual options, of course. With syncing it manually, you can go to a USB connection where you just plug it in, and then you can use File Explorer to copy and paste. Or if you're using iOS, you can do iTunes. Automatic synchronization options can be done through things like OneDrive or Dropbox, or it used to be SkyDrive instead of OneDrive. There's a number of different backups that you can do. You can use the Google Cloud as well. Through Gmail, backup and sync with Android, and then iCloud Drive with iOS. And then there's a Smart Switch and Smart Backup that you can use through Samsung. I've used them before, and they're actually pretty solid. So here we can see Ms. Andrews' iPhone being backed up. We can see that it's set to back up to the computer rather than to the cloud. Now, if you set it to the cloud and you back it up to the computer, it's usually going to take up a lot more space. It's also going to take a lot more time. Because those backups are going to be individually set up as opposed to being incrementally increased in size over time. So here we can see a synchronization app. We've got iCloud, Google Drive, Dropbox, and OneDrive all set up on one PC. And with Microsoft Launcher, Continue on PC, and Apple Handoff, we can actually start an activity on a mobile device and move it to our desktop, or we can, in certain cases, move it back as well. So here we can see those transitions set up so that we can handle those pieces of information on our desktop. So we can see here the Android device has a Continue on PC, and then we can go to the Microsoft Launcher from the Apps menu. It's got up there in the recent stuff. Syncing to an automobile. This is now, of course, something that's very common. We have car synchronization. Newer automobiles offer the option to use Bluetooth to pair smartphones with computers for easy access to your car for music, navigation, and call features. This means that car hacking is going to be even more of a concern, so we have to make sure that we keep our updates current. So updating for any mobile device is generally going to be, you go to Settings, and then either going to be under General or About. And once you go in there, you can type in software update and be able to get what you need. Now, if we have different types of backup, we may have things like file level backup where we only pull individual items, partial image, which is where we're only going to grab a select items. Then we may have full image, and the full image is traditionally going to be a partial image plus the file level stuff, so that you can make sure everything on the device is backed up either to a cloud drive or to a computer. iOS can also use cloud backup and iTunes backup together. I have actually done this to where every couple of months I will actually back everything up to my computer, and then I will clear my cloud backup and back up new stuff. It just allows me to make sure that I'm not holding on to stuff that may have been accidentally retained. To keep your data safe, it's important to understand that access to your device is very critical to maintain. We want to be aware of who has access to it physically and who has access to any passcodes or other access types that we may not want to provide to others. So we can have different types of locks. Like, of course, there's a screen lock to where we would be able to just turn the screen off and turn it back on, and somebody has to swipe across to open it. Pattern lock, where we have to draw a pattern across a number of dots, a passcode, a pin, a fingerprint lock, a face lock. Retinal scan, that's what they were trying to do, an iris scan with Samsung. Retinal scan would be much more invasive and require a laser system. So here we can see some different items that allow us to do different types of locks and smart locks. Smart locks are a little bit more common nowadays because people tend to have smart devices with them. So you can do voice recognition, I was going to say vocal, not voiceal, and then on-body detection. So essentially when it's near you and it knows that you have a smart device on, like a watch or something in proximity, it will allow you to unlock it much more easily. Now, with a screen lock, it's important to understand that what do we do if we have somebody that tries to access something without, erroneously. Somebody's trying to get into it that shouldn't have access. Well, you can restrict that after a certain number of login attempts. If somebody fails, the device will erase itself or will not allow it to be unlocked without connecting it to some kind of host device. Full device encryption will encrypt everything on the device, very much like working with a TPM. Trusted Platform Module. And then multi-factor authentication will allow you to confirm information from an external source in some way, shape, or form. Like you'll text a code to a text message app and it'll spit back a code, or you can use the Authenticator app through Google, through Microsoft. Even certain things like Steam or Blizzard for Battle.net will actually have their own authenticators to protect your account for games and other service-based sites. Software can help secure data. Again, it's all about deterrence, so updating your operating system, antivirus, which strangely has become much more of a prevalent thing. It used to be that people would ask me about antivirus for mobile devices, and I was like, well, unless it's a laptop, I would really say no, but now it's coming to the point where it is really, even if you're on iOS or something that's fairly secure, that backup is really important to have. Knowing who your trusted sources are for different downloads, firewalls, locator apps, and remote wiping, all big deals. So here we can see from which locations we're able to install applications, so that way we can identify areas where we have a potential problem with a source. So if we don't want to be able to install things from Gmail, we can turn that off. If we don't want to be able to install things from Drive, we can turn that off. If we want to install things from Chrome, we can actually go into Chrome and set specific websites that are allowed and go from there. Here we have a locator device, which is able to show GPS information about where the particular device in question has been last located. Now, obviously, if the battery dies, it will show the last place that it was going, and possibly based on a history, you could triangulate where somebody's trying to move to. We can also set it so that if it connects to the internet, it will use the front-facing camera to take pictures of whoever's holding it. It will, send out an alert signal, things like that. Why is this important? Well, because there's a lot of this, BYOD, bring your own device. This is where a student or an employee of an organization is allowed to bring their own device into the corporate or educational network. For security purposes, an organization has to create a profile that can be onboarded to the person's device before allowing it to connect, so that way it is not going to compromise the security in the entire system. A security profile is just a set of policies and procedures that restrict how you can access different resources. Can we make stuff? Can we edit stuff? Can we launch a program? Profile security requirements can be partially implemented by configuration requirements placed on BYOD, and corporate-owned devices will be preloaded with these security profiles to pass forward to the employee. Remote backup and remote wiping applications are almost always going to be part of this. I know that Samsung got a lot of praise and a lot of business because they had developed what was called Samsung Approved for Enterprise, or SAFE, which included their proprietary Knox technology for securing a device remotely. So if we're concerned about malware being on a particular device, we need to be aware that conjecture is not enough. We have to find ways to diagnose, if you will. So some of the big ones would be things like power drain. The battery just seems to be going through a ridiculous amount of charge in a very short period of time. Data speeds being slow. Essentially, the device is running unusually. Now, this doesn't mean like you're in an area that has bad Wi-Fi and you're like, oh man, I must have a virus. It's like, I'm connected to Wi-Fi at work and I'm the only person here. It's like 7 o'clock in the morning. I came in early and my data is just jacked. So what's going on? Well, that might be indicative of something funky going on, or maybe there's just maintenance going on. Again, it's important to go through and find ways to do diagnosis and assess a situation. High resource utilization. Your phone's sitting idle and it's really hot and it seems like it's eating up a lot of memory, that can be potentially problematic. Um, Leaked personal files, all of a sudden, you've got photo uploads that are showing up where they shouldn't be, things like that. Strange text messages or pop-ups. Data transmission over limits. So if you have a metered connection through your cell phone provider and it's like, hey, you've been using a lot of data this month, blah, 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 we need to check what's going on, and you know that you haven't been engaging in a ton of data usage, or if you've been on Wi-Fi for the majority, it's important to go ahead and check that stuff out. Dropped calls, Wi-Fi connections you don't recognize, Bluetooth, the camera or microphone seems to be acting strangely. There's just, what I normally say is, if it seems weird, it doesn't hurt you to check it out. If, on the other hand, you ignore it and it turns out to be something bad, then you aren't being proactive, and it's much harder to try and stem the flow, if you will, try and stop the damage. So to remove malware from a mobile device, this is a big part of why I do updates of my phone to my local device as opposed to just doing stuff in the cloud. I will remove any app that I feel has been acting strangely. I will make sure the iOS, in my case, or Android OS has been updated, and then perform a factory reset. To keep a mobile device clean, an anti-malware app is not a bad idea. And make sure that we don't open email from any weird sources. Don't download any shared files that you don't recognize. I traditionally try not to download files from email onto my phone at all. If I can, I just do it directly to a desktop, which I know has a significantly stronger anti-malware contingent present. Make sure you keep your OS updates current. I don't know a lot of people that don't update their operating systems at least multiple times a week. But again, I work as a security technician and instructor, so that's a big part of what we do. I recommend for most people that if you don't update your security settings at least once a week, like if you don't have an automatic update going through, you may want to check why. Like when I had people, when I was working for Best Buy, bring in a phone and they were saying, oh man, it's got all these problems, I'd be like, all right, well, let's take a look. So I'd plug it in, I'd go ahead and check for the software update. Of course, they're several iterations behind, and then all of their apps are behind as well. Like this is before I do the OS update, so that means that the privacy settings and the bug fixes and all that stuff for the apps are also not working. So I go in, I do all these updates, I go ahead and do a soft reset, which means I just turn the phone off and back on, so that clears out the cache, and then I make sure that any app they don't need has been removed. Then I hand it back to them and say, go ahead and make a call, try and send an email, send a text message, load a game if you've got one, things like that, and see what happens. And they look at me like some kind of like on the road to Damascus conversion, like, how did you do this? And it's just, think about it. Over time, what would happen if you didn't brush your teeth? Like if you were like, nah, they feel fine, my teeth aren't hurting, so obviously I'm doing okay, and you just didn't brush your teeth for like 6 weeks, things would probably get pretty nasty after a while, okay? Even though like the friction of food going against your teeth would scrape off like some plaque, the stuff between your teeth would still get really nasty and you'd get discoloration. It would just be very, very unpleasant. So, it's the same idea. You don't wait until there's a problem to start making these little fixes happen. You want to start incrementally. A phrase that I often use, and I heard it all the time as a kid, I'm sure you did too, is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Now, of course, a pound is 16 ounces. So we're talking, mathematically, a significant reduction in investment. If you're buying something by the pound versus buying it by the ounce, the cost is going to be significantly different. And in certain cases, that phrase is just indicating the amount of work that is involved. Just this little bit of work here, this little bit of change there, versus a huge amount of work that has to be expended in order to fix it. A lot of the times, what I'll do, if I have a customer come in and they have a huge amount of problems, is I will make sure that they back up like photos, text messages, voicemails, anything that's not, anything that's not replaceable, and then flush the entire phone. Go ahead and wipe it back to factory, get everything updated, and then put their stuff back on. Now, this takes a significant amount of time. I had customers when I was at Best Buy that would come in at 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. They'd leave their phone, and they would come back every 2 to 3 hours checking on it. And it would take me the majority of my shift, where when I was leaving at 5, I was like, all right, you got like 97%. It should be able to finish the rest of it on cellular, or it'll reconnect when you get back home and get on Wi-Fi. And I don't, at the time, I didn't make any attempt to be really rushy about getting it done. A, because I wanted it done well, but B, I also wanted it to be a bit of an object lesson for the person in question to say, this is what happens when you wait this long to make these changes. You have to do these little incremental cleanup steps. Otherwise, it's like trying to, push over a mountain with a pickup truck. You can't do it. You gotta bring in some heavy ordnance at that point to really get it done. Now, let's talk about the IoT, the Internet of Things. These are devices that are connected to the internet for a specific purpose. So we're used to devices that are connected for multiple purposes. So things like your smartphone, your tablet, your laptop, your desktop. These are all things that have a lot of different functionality. But in general, IoT devices like a smart thermostat or a smart fridge, even something like smart lights, those are going to be very particular in terms of how they function and why they're connected the way they are. So let's take a look at the wireless technologies involved as well as how to set up a basic smart network. Besides Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, which we're really pretty commonly used to, there are also things like Zigbee and Z-Wave. These two technologies are often used by things like smart locks, smart light bulbs, smart thermostats, smart appliances, things like that. They run around 900 megahertz for both, or Zigbee can run in the Bluetooth range of about 2.4. Now, they require significantly less power than Wi-Fi and have a range of about 20 meters. Now, if we're talking about normal Bluetooth, that range is normally about 30 meters. And Wi-Fi can sometimes cover a pretty broad range depending on how much power is behind the transmitter. Now, Zigbee and Z-Wave are not compatible. They don't work well together. You would have to use an adapter in order to allow Zigbee devices connecting to a Z-Wave system. There are home gateways that I've seen that are compatible with Zigbee, Z-Wave, Bluetooth, and Wi-Fi. Now, both of these devices can connect in what's called a mesh configuration, which means that every device connects to every other, or partial mesh, which is where most of the devices connect to each other. And this is beneficial because if you have like a smart light that's in a room, it can bounce its signal off of another smart light, which is connected to the proper range of the device. So you can extend it beyond 20 meters in certain cases without having to buy a repeater. Now, Zigbee and Z-Wave are about equal in terms of market share for smart home devices. I've seen both quite a bit. Another standard we may see is RFID, though that is a little bit less common because the range for RFID is going to be a little bit different. And of course, the RFID reader itself has to be active, whereas the tag is traditionally going to be passive. So those configurations typically are not able to give the same kind of dynamic range in terms of interaction as Zigbee and Z-Wave. Now, for the most basic smart home configurations, you're going to need some kind of interface to be able to control it, so a phone or a tablet, Wi-Fi home network with internet access, and then some kind of smart device. For smart devices to become IoT, they have to be able to connect to the internet, hence the I in IoT, the Internet of Things. So here we can see our home router, and it's able to connect to our Zigbee bridge, our Bluetooth bridge, etc., and it's able to connect to all of the different devices in question. Now we're able to connect through the internet to the manufacturer's website, which is able to receive configuration information and pass it to our phone. So this is where we can have cloud-based backup and controls for different things. You can also enhance our smart home network with, as we talked about before, things like Alexa or the Amazon Echo or Echo Dot. Google Assistant and Google Home, these also will work, and then Siri and the HomePod by Apple. So these digital assistants that we talked about very early on are also going to be usable with a smart speaker. These controller hubs, like the HomePod, are going to allow us to control smart devices that use different manufacturer apps and different wireless technologies. You'll often hear about Amazon Alexas having what are called skills. These skills are going to be predefined tasks that are triggered by a particular phrase or a particular app interaction. So here we can see a Google Home standard smart speaker. I actually have a Google Home Mini. Works reasonably well, but again, I'm super paranoid, so I tend to not use it. I'll use it to set up things just for like if we have guests over and we want to be able to play music and things like that, but in general, it stays off. Now, mobile devices in general tend to contain very few FRU, or field replaceable units. So this means that troubleshooting is largely restricted to software in the field. The cost of replacement for parts traditionally exceeds the value of fixing the device. So unless you have a pre-existing like insurance plan for your mobile device, it's generally not going to be worth it to try and fix stuff. Now, laptops are a bit of an exception, but it depends on the laptop, what the damage is, and how old the device is. Now, there's a number of device problems that you can run into that you can try and fix just by using the OS tools itself. The web, of course, being a great source of information. If it's a hardware issue, that of course changes the game. But if it's a software thing, like something's just not responding correctly, then yeah, we can chase down some YouTube tutorials. We can try some basic techniques, and we can follow the same 6 to 7 step troubleshooting things that we've used before. We're going to interview the user, we're going to go ahead and do some observations, we're going to start formulating a theory, we're going to test the theory, implement the fix, and then we're going to do a post-fix test, make sure that it works correctly, and then do our documentation wrap-up. So with mobile phones, it's a little bit different because generally if we have an issue with an app, we can force close it, remove it, and reinstall it, or we can reboot, turning things all the way off, or restart the device from within the OS, which is called a soft boot. Or you can do a full factory reset. That's pretty aggressive, but it's what's there. I'm not going to read all of the different update, repair, and restore things there because in certain cases these may actually be out of date. I know in certain cases Android, it just depends on what version you're using and what type of device. In general, what I recommend is just to pull a quick YouTube tutorial because those tend to have the most current information. Look at when it was published, look at what devices it supports. Here we can see an Android device that's been rebooted into safe mode, and you can see that third-party applications do not load in safe mode. So if it's not a standard first-party app, it won't run. So it means that you're going to see slightly different listings in your apps about what's going on. But this also will make sure that if it is a problem with a third-party app, that you're going to be able to go in and remove it or clear storage. Here we have reset for iOS. You can see that there's a bit of difference in how that's laid out. Instead of it being graphical, it's much more textual. So you can see here that we can reset the keyboard library so that we can make sure that if the dictionary is including a term that is misspelled or things like that, we can clear that. We can reset our home screens where all of our apps are laid out instead of being hidden, within folders. We can reset location and privacy settings. We can clear network settings. There's a lot of different options there. Again, checking out the manual or the online help file would probably be strongly recommended. Now this is what's called recovery mode, or sometimes also called DFU, which is where we're going to go ahead and put a physical connection to the iOS device and hook it back up to a desktop in order to restore what's called the IPSW, which is the iPhone or iPod or iPad software package to load the firmware again. And it'll reload the iOS firmware, and then you can restore from a backup or something similar. Now, be aware, if we're going to use a factory reset, we're going to flush everything. So it means it's going to start all the way back to what it looked like when it left the factory, in terms of the software. It's not going to, obviously, like if you got a chip in the screen, that's a hardware thing. Some other issues that we may have, if the battery is running low really quickly, number one, your battery may be dying, depending on how old it is. I know with iOS now, it actually has a predictive model that it uses to identify when your battery life is starting to get beyond the normal wear and tear stage where you need to have it serviced. Disable your wireless connections, close apps when you're not using them, things like that. If you have a smartwatch that's often paired, you may want to make sure if there's an update, for whatever apps you're using, because there may be an efficiency issue that can be updated. If you're having issues with the touch screen, make sure the device is clean. Make sure you're not using a junky screen protector. Screen protectors, especially the cheap ones, tend to be made out of a plastic that will start to bubble, and that will make it difficult to make contact between your finger and the capacitive touch screen. You may also have a device that is very, very sensitive, which means if there's like a hair or a piece of moisture that's trapped, that will continually try and register as a touch. So you want to make sure that that is taken care of. Don't leave the original screen protector film on the phone. I had so many people that tried to do that with their phones when they first bought them. Instead of buying a screen protector, they literally just took like a razor blade and trimmed off the screen protector that was there. The problem was that covers the ear hole, so you can't hear anything. So it doesn't work. No sound or distorted sound from the speakers. Check Bluetooth. Check to make sure the volume is not cranked all the way down. Volume will actually retain different memory levels depending on whether or not it's connected to an external source or an internal source. If the display is dim, adjust your brightness. Again, make sure your screen is clean, because if something is blocking your light sensor or is causing it to have an erroneous output, then that will cause you to have either excessively bright or excessively dim displays. If you're having issues with Bluetooth, traditionally what I do is I just remove the device and then repair it, because that usually takes me less than a minute. Wi-Fi connectivity, reboot your phone, reboot your network if you can, disconnect and then reconnect, making sure that the password is current, that sort of thing. And if you're having issues with your signal, be it Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or cellular, try updating the device's firmware. What I will sometimes do is I will actually take the SIM card out of the device, reboot it, and then reboot it again with the SIM card back in place. What that does is it clears the internal cache that it's looking for to try and connect to different towers. Sometimes what you'll see is to update what's called an APN, access point node, or access point network, depending on who you're talking to. You can also update your PCL. There's a couple of different updates that you can do, especially with Android. Android's really good at trying to clear out the tower cache if it's getting backed up or if it's stuck. If your GPS isn't functioning, make sure that your location services have been edited. Decrypting mail. Generally, I don't work a lot with encrypted email that doesn't have its own application. So you may actually have to create a new public and private key. Apps not loading, that can be due to insufficient space. Clear out anything you don't need. In modern contexts, most phones start out at 64 to 128 gigs. If you're filling up that kind of storage that quickly, you may want to figure out why. Like if you're taking a bunch of photos, then use something like Google Photos or Flickr or some kind of backup system in order to back those photos up and then remove them from the local device. I know that Google Photos in particular will actually allow you to upload your photos, and then once it logs that those photos have been updated, it will automatically remove them once you give permission. So that tends to be handy. You can also try and download a cleaner app, but that usually causes more problems in my experience, especially because there's a ton of cleaner apps out there and they're all a little bit predatory. So I tend to be very wary of stuff like that. If you have apps that have an error log, you may want to identify what those errors are, so that way you can see what the problem is at the application level. So here we can see location services being worked with on a particular app, and you can see being able to turn them off for several different apps. So if you have location services turned on all the time, then that means that your CPU is constantly pushing information to each of those apps about your physical location based on your GPS. The rate at which that refreshes, things like that, can all affect your battery life as well as your system's responsiveness in terms of running heavily intensive apps. Here we can see a storage problem. This is only a 4 gig phone, so that's probably part of the issue, but we could theoretically dump that based on, we've got entertainment apps or photos or things like that that are eating up space. If we're running on a system that freezes, this traditionally means, when a system freezes, it normally means that there's a memory error, and it locks because it's trying not to cause something to crash. It's trying to what's called fail gracefully, so that way it logs out and tries to preserve everything so it doesn't crash the hard disk, things like that. What I will also do in the case of a frozen system is not only I'll turn it completely off, I would recommend trying to recharge it, and then of course make sure that all of your updates are good. If you have a system lockout, like I have a toddler, and if he got a hold of my phone and tried to unlock it by pressing buttons because he thinks pressing buttons is fun, then he might accidentally wipe my phone, because that's how I have mine set up. But if it does have a timer that essentially tries to slow a person down who's trying to brute force your passcode, you may have to go to, for Android devices, you'd have to go to the Android Google interface, or for iOS, you'd have to go to the iCloud device webpage, which I believe is just iCloud.apple.com. If it's overheating, make sure that you do not have a case that is blocking the system from being able to radiate heat correctly. if it's been sitting in direct sunlight, if it's been plugged in too long, things like that. You want to make sure that you're putting it somewhere that it'll be able to cool off on its own. Don't stick it in the fridge or the freezer. That will cause condensation to form and could possibly short out the device. So you want to just put it somewhere that's relatively cool, dry, out of the way, and let it cool down on its own. And then there's our chapter summary for chapter 9. So again, it's all the same stuff we talked about before. We've got the big four with Android, iOS, Windows, and Chrome OS. Of course, Android and Chrome OS are pretty closely related, but that's really just because of the fact that they're both Google products. Securing devices is very important. So if you have only one method of authentication, make sure that you have a backup for that. Speaking of backups, make sure you back up your data regularly, because if you have an issue with malware or things like that, the nuclear option is always to just go ahead and flush it, completely wipe it. And then, of course, talking about the IoT connectivity and doing basic troubleshooting. Make sure that you're checking compatibility. Don't try and hook up a Zigbee system to a Z-Wave receiver or vice versa. If you have a little plug-in that you can use to hook up your Wi-Fi router to make sure that it's compatible with Zigbee and Z-Wave, that's cool too. Again, it's part of planning. It's something that we do as technicians, and we don't always think about, when we're looking at purchasing things. We have to think about how all this stuff is going to lay out. It's like, oh, I'm at Best Buy and hey, this Zigbee stuff is on the cheap, but I don't have a Zigbee receiver. So then you got to start doing all these financial outlays to make up the difference. But yeah, that's it, man. So if you guys have any questions or concerns, you can always shoot me an email, or you can contact me via my Google Voice number, which is going to be on my syllabus page for our course. And other than that, feel free to leave a comment. I always try and make sure these videos are updated so that you guys get the most current information. But I always thank you so much for your time and attention. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you guys, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. See you next class.